The French press, nothing.
All right, how's everybody doing today?
Good.
Okay. So, let's make sure we're live. We are live. Okay, so what we're going to do today is do some Kabbalistic insights into Passover, into the Seder, into the Haggadah. Just FYI, the next Sunday, of course, is the first day of Pesach, so there will not be a class. And the following Sunday is the last day of Pesach, so there will not be a class. However, there will be a Mashiach feast at the end the following Sunday, which is April 20th at 7:30 p.m. We'll be gathering here for the Feast of Mashiach as instituted by the Baal Shem Tov, and we'll do some mystical insights into the Messianic era. We'll sing songs, we'll share stories, go from Passover into, take the energy of Pesach into the days that follow. Okay. So let's start with first a general idea connected to Pesach. That is the dominant energy or the main mitzvah of Pesach is, anybody? It's the main mitzvah of Pesach.
Remember,
Good.
telling the story, remembering.
No, he's right. I mean, you're right also. That's the main mitzvah of the Seder. But the main mitzvah of Pesach is actually the not eating of chametz. Okay? So Kabbalistically, the prohibitions are actually spiritually greater than the positive mitzvahs of the Torah. Why? Sometimes when you have the ability to access something through a positive action, it means that there's an accessible relationship. When the only way to relate to something is by the not doing, that means that the relationship transcends anything you can possibly do. Let me say that again. When you can relate to something through a positive action, that means there's a relationship between the two things, and that relationship lives in the space of the action. So let's talk about relationships. In relationships, you have, for example, you have relationships that are defined by like an intellectual relationship, right? So people speak to each other. They share insights. What are you experiencing? You're experiencing the person's speech, right? So you're relating on a speech level. Morning. Please grab a Haggadah there in the box. If you don't mind, grab a kippah in the. You'll help him out there. Okay, thank you. Depending on the person's level of comprehension, that verbal relationship will also reflect an intellectual relationship, right? But just because somebody speaks, it doesn't mean that the other person understands. Then you perhaps, please make yourself comfortable. The bagels are for the taking if you want one.
Thank you.
As is the coffee. Then you have a relationship that might be, let's say, a parent-child relationship, which is expressed in, it lives beneath the surface, right? It doesn't, but then when you say, I love you, or you give the child an embrace, that relationship is reflecting a deeper relationship beyond words. Somebody asks you to do something for them and you're responsive. So now your relationship is defined by the actions, right? So relationships live on all kinds of levels, from professional relationships to intimate relationships and so on. But what all of these relationships have in common is that they're defined by some kind of expression. There's something positive. There's some kind of positive expression that's being engaged in that defines the nature of the relationship. So if you take away that action, right? If you're in a business partnership and your part of the partnership is putting in capital and you don't put in capital, the relationship falls apart. If you're an employee and your job is to listen to the boss and you don't do what you're told, you lose your job, right? Because your relationship is defined by the action parameters of that relationship. But then you have a relationship that's defined by the not doing. So God says, thou shalt not. So in a sense, that relationship is much more profound, because as long as you are just by being yourself, just by being, without doing anything, the relationship is manifest. There's no part of you that needs to do something to be worthy of the relationship, for the relationship to exist. And it's a very profound idea, because it's the truth, meaning we are worthwhile in our relationship with God just by virtue of the fact that we are. God chose us. We were born into this world, born into this people. That's it. We are. By the way, and this is why when the Jewish people sinned with the golden calf, and God said he wanted to wipe out the people, Moses said to God, if you're going to get rid of them, take me out of your book. I don't want to be associated with you if you're going to destroy the Jewish people. Why? Because he says to God, if your relationship with the Jewish people is only defined by their actions or their inactions, then that's a very superficial relationship. It's not really a superficial relationship, but if that's all it is, if that's where it ends, then that's not the relationship that I want to have with God. I want to have a relationship with God that transcends that. That makes sense? It's a very powerful idea. And there's we know God's name is spelled Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, God's main primary name. And it's brought down in the teachings of Kabbalah that there's a verse in the Torah that says, Zeh Shmi la'olam, this is my name forever. V'zeh zichri l'dar dar, and this is my remembrance for all generations. So this passage in the Kabbalah says that Shmi, the word Shmi, my name, has a numeric value of 350. If you add the first two letters of God's name, the Yud and the Hey, which is 10 and 5, you get 365. 365 is the numeric equivalent of the negative commandments of the Torah, the prohibitions. Zichri, this is my remembrance, is 237. And if you add the Vav and the Hey, the second two letters of God's name, which is 11, you get 248, which is the number of positive commandments in the Torah. Now, whether you got all that numerology or not, here's the main point, that the first two letters of God's name are associated with the negative commandments, the prohibitions, whereas the second two letters are associated with the positive commandments. You would think that the first two letters of God's name, which are, so to speak, the higher letters of God's name, would be associated with the positive commandments, the second two letters with the negative commandments. But therein lies the message we're saying here, is that the access, the connection that we have with God through the observing the prohibitions, which we observe them by not doing, are higher than the positive actions. Yes?
Very different than we think about human relations.
Yes, 100%. But think about this in the context of intimate relationships, because that's really where this manifests itself in any kind of human counterpart. Why? Because most of our other relationships are actually strategic alliances, right? There's a convenience in it, right? There's a social contract, right? There's a social contract we have with the world. You stop at a red light. You say thank you to the grocery, the bagger at the grocery store. You're nice to your banker. We want something from each other. Even if we're really nice people, we still want something out of this exchange, right? In an intimate relationship, hopefully, we're not looking to get something out of it. We're looking for connection. And good morning. And as much as that connection is made through positive actions, the connection fundamentally just is. Or at least we hope it just is. Ideally, it just is. How do you preserve that? How do you preserve that relationship? By not violating it. Now, it's not enough just to have the relationship. You have to do the actions, because we do have a human component to us that requires the external expression. But a strong relationship just is. Okay, so let's bring this back to the mitzvah, the main mitzvah of Pesach, which is not eating the chametz. Now, of course, there's the positive dimensions, which is eat the matzah, which is do the Seder, and so on and so forth. But the main mitzvah of Pesach is to not eat the chametz. And we have stories of great Hasidim and throughout the ages of Jews who were in circumstances where they couldn't observe the Seder. They didn't have the matzah, they didn't have the wine, they didn't have whatever it might have been, but they were still careful not to eat the chametz. They subsisted on whatever they could just to survive the holiday, but they didn't eat the chametz, because that's the main expression of the connection with Hashem. So let's bring this. So that's just an insight into the overall concept of negative and positive commandments. But let's take it into a different dimension. So the word for leaven in Hebrew is chametz matzah, right? You know that song from the Manishtana? Chametz is leaven, and matzah is matzah. How do you spell chametz? Ches or chet, mem, tzadik. Okay, remember the mem and the tzadik. How do you spell matzah? Mem, tzadik. Hey. So the common denominator between chametz and matzah is mem and tzadik. Where is the distinction? The ches and the hey. And if I can borrow your pen. Thank you. Sorry, wrote the wrong letter. So this letter here is a ches. And then one next to it is a hey. What's the difference between a ches and a hey? The space, right? Whether the letter is connected or not. Okay, so let's talk about what that means. So when Cain killed Abel, and God punished him, he was despondent. So the Torah says, it's very interesting kind of poetic language that God tells him. At the time, he says, La pesach chatas roivetz. At the opening, sin crouches. And it's up to us whether we're going to, so to speak, embrace the sin or not let the sin in. But if you think about sin inside of ourselves, what is that? What's the driver of sin? First of all, what is sin? Sin in Hebrew, chet means lacking. So what causes us to lack? Give me it on a more, let's do it not on a spiritual level, on a very physical level, very human level. What drives us to sin?
Desire to fulfill your body's needs, which are separate from the soul's.
Okay, so what is the body's needs?
To maintain homeostasis.
Okay.
To be scientific about it, I mean to survive.
Survive. So where is that? Okay, I'll help you. And what is the animal soul? Ego. Thank you. Ego. There's a need for all of this is ego, right? By the way, ego is not necessarily bad, right? Ego is a necessary driver. If we don't have ego, then we're a shmata. A shmata is or a rag, right? So we're not ego is necessary. The problem is when, what do they say in AA? When it's will run, I forget the language. Something will run amok, something like that. Basically, when there's nothing wrong with the ego, it's when the ego takes over. When the ego is in charge, when we let the ego take over control of the body, take control of everything, then we get in trouble. But will run riot, that's the word. Will run riot. When we let the will just run riot, do its own thing, then we get in trouble, right? So what do we need to prevent the will from running wild? What do we need to temper the ego, to harness the ego, really? We need an opening. We need humility, right? There's the classic idea of somebody who's actually related to Pharaoh. It says that the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh hardened his heart. And then the second 5 plagues, it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, right? So what changed? So sometimes a person digs themselves such a hole that they can't get themselves out of it. They're so obsessed with their ego and being right or not being wrong, whatever it might be, that they keep on digging, thinking that they're getting out, but in the process, they're just digging a deeper hole, right? It's unfortunate. We all sometimes in our lives get stuck in that spot, but we see people, and it's a very sad thing when you see people who are just, they lost their own awareness, that they've dug themselves into such a place that they're just digging themselves deeper. And sometimes all you got to do is just stop what you're doing, right? Just close your mouth for a minute, and then maybe you can begin your recovery process, right? So what we need is an opening. We need a way out. The hay has an opening. It's a way out. The matzah represents the opening. The opening is the humility. It's a recognition that there's something bigger than us. The ches is sealed. The ches is sealed, which means that when that ego gets into us, there's no way out except for inflating ourselves. To use a psychological terminology, when we only get our value, when our self-worth comes from other things or other people, it creates this codependence, it creates an inflation of ego. It drives us to all kinds of dark places. When we get our self-worth from God, by the way, it's the driver of everything. Really, it's the driver of every unhealthy dimension of our lives is driven by the defining our self-worth by something else, something or someone else. And by the way, I'm not being critical. It's the human condition, right? Each of us are born into a body with a complex set of genetics. We're coming to this world with a particular set of parents. We're raised in a particular environment, and all of that contributes to that reality of who we are. And our job in life is to go back to the core identity that we are worthwhile just because God created us, and that at our core we have a soul. And that's even if we've made mistakes along the way. We're still exactly the way God wants us. That's the humility that opens that door for us to then, next time we encounter a challenging situation that maybe we're driven by some other force, to say, whoa, stop. I don't have to do that just because my genetics are wired that way. I don't have to do that just because it's going to impress my wife or my mother or my father or my neighbor or whatever. I can do that because it connects me with God. Or I won't do it because it disconnects me from God. Morning. So that's matzah. Matzah is the humility. It's the opening. And by the way, the top is chachma. I'm sorry, the top is machshava, is thought. The right side is dibur, is speech. Thought and speech are always connected. What's disconnected is maisa, action. There has to be a pause between the thought and speech and the action. I don't know if that was for us or the security guard stepped away. So there has to be a pause. I don't know where this line comes from, but I read it somewhere. God is in the pause. Have you heard that expression? Right? How do you, huh? God is in the silence.
That's another.
Yeah. God is in the pause. That's the same principle. It's like when you take a moment, right? You're having a lot of it's not, I don't want to credit the Eastern religions for it because it's the very beginning of the Torah when Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chaim, God breathed into him the breath of life, right? The breath, that's the pause. What are you doing? You're breathing in godliness. You're breathing in divinity. You're taking a moment to pause, to let the consciousness of God come in. And sometimes that's all it takes. That's the magic, right? You just stop. You stop the output of the ego. Now, before we go further, I'm going to move into other insights. I was thinking about this particular teaching this morning, and it can seem very ominous, right? But I want to really, I don't like the word dumb it down because that may be a commentary on your audience, and that's not nice. I want to bring it into a very, very practical, real, experiential manner, and that's like this. The word I want you to take home on this idea is alignment, right? Alignment. Right. So what happens when your car is not aligned? So at the beginning, it doesn't really feel like much, but 100, 500, 1,000, 2,000 miles down the road, your tire is lopsided. Then it gets a hole and it pops. We get in trouble. Alignment, and alignment is also another very important thing. Just like your car, even if you align, you spend the money on getting it aligned, people only really do it if it's really out of alignment, or if you got very expensive tires and you're into that stuff. Otherwise, you wait till you have a problem. But if you do really like your tires, you just did yours good. You must like your tires. If you really like your tires, you have to constantly check on them to check your alignment. You can't just align it to, I'm going to align myself every 5,000 miles, right? You have to constantly be checking on them. The difference between chametz and matzah is alignment. It's not a perfect system. Perfection belongs to God. Our journey is to constantly realign ourselves. And we can realign ourselves simply by waking up in the morning and saying the Moda'ani, taking a moment before we get out of bed to recognize that God's in control. He's restored our soul, to kiss the mezuzah before we leave the home, to put on tefillin in the morning, to take a moment on Shabbat to recognize the holiness of the day, to sit at a Passover. And we have endless opportunities in our faith and our tradition, what they call spiritual practice, to realign ourselves. And these are not external behaviors. That's what's, unfortunately, they call it pediatric Judaism, right? Where so much of what we do just because it's what they taught us as kids. We learned it in preschool or in Sunday school. But it's actually a very deep experience. Every time we do something spiritual and we just pause and say, what is this about? I'm just bringing a consciousness of God into my being right now. That's alignment. And that's what matzah is. The reality is that we only celebrate Pesach for 8 days. There's only 8 days that we remove from ourselves the leaven, because you can't live life in that space. We have to live life in the real world. And in the real world, there's leaven. We interact with it. We have ego inside of ourselves. Nothing wrong with that. The main thing is to constantly bring it back to the true identity of who we are, which is that at our core, we're a soul, and then the body becomes a servant to the soul. So it's really about alignment. That's all of that sophisticated talk is about aligning ourselves, bringing a consciousness of God into our being. Okay. Any questions on that before we go on to the Seder. Don't be shy. You're among friends here.
Well, can I ask a separate question?
Sure.
So when we talk about Kabbalah, what is your framework, right? You know, I've been to Tzfat, they talk about that. I've been to the Kabbalah Center in the Hollywood Hills. You know, everybody's got their own. So how are we approaching that?
Good. So what Kabbalah is very broad in the sense that it's rooted in the teachings of the Zohar. The word Kabbalah means to receive, right? And right, lekabel. So what are we receiving? We're receiving the inner dimension of Torah. So just like you have the external dimension of the body, and then as you begin to peel away layers, you have intellect, you have emotion, you have the psyche, you have the spirit, and so on and so forth. The same thing is true with Torah. And what the books are, so to speak, are just the container that contains the inner dimension of Torah. And there are many different books of Kabbalah, starting with the Zohar from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We have the books of Kabbalah from the Arizal, from Rabbi Chaim Vital. And in our times, meaning the last couple hundred years, the teachings of Chassidus is what gives us access to these teachings. Because the objective is not just to have profound teachings, it's to take these teachings and bring them down in a way that we can apply in our lives.
And that would be separate from, let's say, the oral teaching.
No, the teachings of Kabbalah are part of the oral tradition. Anything that's not in the text of the 5 books of Moses or the books of the prophets and scriptures, we can pull up some other chairs here. Good morning. No, don't be sorry. We're glad you're here. So the anything that's not in the 5 books of the Torah or the books of the prophets or scriptures is considered the oral tradition. Within the oral tradition, you have Midrash, you have Talmud, you have Jewish law, you have Kabbalah, and so on and so forth. Okay, more on that another time. Okay, let's talk about the Seder. So there are 3 matzahs, right, on the at the Seder, and then on top of the matzah, we place the Seder items. Now, some people have Seder trays, Seder plates, silver containers that have 3 levels on it, and then the plate on the top. There are others that have, the matzahs with various different cloth between it, and then the plate that sits on top of it. All of those details, we've got to pull up more tables, more chairs. There's more people coming in here. It's a full house today. See, Pesach's coming. Yeah. I don't think I'm popular. I think the Torah is popular. Kabbalah is popular. Yeah, we can pull up some chairs over here. You guys can move a little closer. So, okay, so what's the number 6 and what's the number 3? So there are many different teachings around this. The one that I'm going to focus on and reference is the 3 matzahs represent our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The 4 cups of wine that we drink at the Seder represent the matriarchs, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. Okay, on top of the Seder plate, and we probably have a picture in here. By the way, this Haggadah was made by people with handicaps. They drew it with their mouth or their foot. It's a fascinating Haggadah. Yeah.
Oh.
And this is yours to take home, please.
Oh.
Okay, look on page 8. Okay, page 8. We have an image of the Seder plate. Page 8. Ocho. Shmona. So we have an image of the Seder plate. So I want you to, for a moment, to imagine the 3 matzahs sitting underneath the Seder plate. In in one of the core teachings of Kabbalah is that there's light and vessel. What does that mean? Just like if I want to drink this coffee, and everybody knows that coffee is my favorite analogy. If I want to drink this coffee, I need a cup. If I don't have a cup, I can't drink the coffee. Light, which by the way, light is also just a language for us to relate to God, but God isn't light any more than he's a paper cup, right? God is God. He's beyond any kind of description. We use light in Kabbalah. Throughout Kabbalah, light is used as a way to refer to God because the properties of light mirror some of the core properties of God's manifestation in terms of how we relate to it. So for example, light illuminates, right? When we have a relationship with God, we are illuminated. Our consciousness is illuminated. Light brings warmth. When we have a relationship with God and a consciousness of God, we feel warmth in our being. Light, the light that is manifest from the luminary, be it the sun or the light bulb, the light itself isn't what diminishes the power of the luminary, right? In other words, the sun is not becoming diminished because it shines, right? Whatever may be happening to the sun over the next bazillion years isn't because the sun gives light. It's because there's gases and fires and heat and whatever that happens. But the light itself doesn't diminish from the sun. The light of the sun doesn't take you into consideration. It just is. In other words, if you want to receive the light, you have to open your blinds. If you don't want to receive the light, you close the blinds. If you have too much light, you get burned up. If you don't have enough light, you can't see. Right? So these are some of the properties that are discussed, why we use light as an analogy. But one thing is clear. Just like the light of the sun, right? The light of the sun would go on indefinitely unless there was a vessel, right? It hits the earth, it hits a receptacle, it hits another planet, it hits something that then refracts the light. If you have a seed in the ground, then the right amount of light, then that seed will actually grow into something. So the light requires a vessel. Now the problem is that God is the light and God is the vessel. So how does God himself become the vessel to his own light? Because essentially, when God creates the vessel, it's made out of light also, right? You get the paradox? So if God is the vessel, then how does he put his light into it in a way that contains himself? Now, I'm not going to give you the answer. There's an 8-page discourse from the Alter Rebbe that analyzes this. But what I want to focus on is that there is a diminishing force that God built into the process of creation. So we know there are 4 worlds. The top world is the world of Atzilus, or Atzilut, which means the world of emanation. Then we go into the world of creation, formation, and action. We live in the world of action. We live in the physical manifestation of the world of action. And throughout the year, in the various different discourses that we study, we touch upon this. But there is a major distinction between the first world, the world of Atzilut, the world of emanation, and the lower 3 worlds. And that is that in the world of Atzilut, there is a unity between the vessels and the light in a way where they're almost indistinguishable. So let's contrast it to our consciousness in the physical reality. When you wake up in the morning, you have a self-consciousness. You put your feet on the ground, you feel the earth beneath you, right? You put your clothing on, you feel the texture of the clothing, which is why we say all these blessings. We thank God for giving us a floor underneath us. We thank God for giving us shoes and a belt and clothing and so on, and eyes, and because we're conscious of that. Shouldn't take it for granted. But our first consciousness is the vessel. We're the vessel. The world, the earth is the vessel. Then we move from a consciousness of vessel into a place of light. To bring into the vessel or to become aware. Sometimes we have to bring into the vessel, and sometimes we just need to become aware that there's already light in the vessel. The reality is that both our body and the light are both formed by God. But because God gives us the self-consciousness, we have to parse out what is vessel and what is light. This makes sense?
Almost.
Almost.
More or less.
Yeah, so it's a challenging thing to think about because we live in the space of the vessel. That's our consciousness. Go ahead.
So one way to think of it is as a giver and a receiver. It's hard for me to wrap my head around it completely, but is that sort of?
Yeah, that's great. That's actually a great analogy because what would we call at the core an unhealthy relationship?
Imbalance, maybe?
What's well, it's a buzzword today, and I think it's a very profound place that people get to before you begin to heal a relationship is codependence. What does it mean? What does codependence mean? Codependence is where there's no me and you. There's this fusion, right? What's wrong with that? You say, oh, it's beautiful. Like you have no identity. Your whole identity is your wife or your husband. That's not healthy. Why? Because God didn't make us fused. He made us, You'd be broke. God made us with a self-consciousness. And that's important. As we said before, not an ego consciousness, but a self-consciousness. Because God created me and he created you. When there's me and there's you, then when I serve you, it's authentic. It's a choice I'm making. When there's a codependence, meaning when I get my identity from you, not from me, and when I say me, I mean the real me, right? When I recognize, because by the way, when I recognize that my identity comes from God, I actually show up in the world in the healthiest way. I don't show up as an angel. I show up as me, because me is exactly what God created, with all my warts and flaws and everything, and my strengths. That's me. That's the me that God created. Oh, okay, there's me with all of my parts. How do I serve in this world? How do I bring me to the table? God made me who I am. He didn't make you me, because then I'd have a different job. But he made me, so I have to bring me to the table and serve. But if my identity comes from you, then I'm not really serving God. I'm serving you, and I'm not here to serve you. I'm here to serve God. If God wants me to serve you, then I'm here to serve you. But it has to be coming from that place. So codependence is a fusion that's not healthy. So how did we get into this?
Somehow we were in the
You were
matzah.
asking, giver and receiver. So giver and receiver. So it's actually a great parallel for giver and receiver, for light and vessel. Because in order for there to be, they say, if you can't say no, you're not really saying yes, right? Somebody who's a very kind person, and every time somebody asks them to do something, they say yes, they're not really saying yes. They just don't know how to say no. They don't have any self-identity. It's not real kindness. It's just their wiring, right? And it's their consciousness, which is they have no self. So to be a real giver, you have to see yourself as a giver. You have to be something separate from the receiver. Which is why God created us. By the way, if you want to think about it, why did God create us in the first place? Because God wanted to give. It says that God is good, and the nature of good is to do good, but God had no one to do good with, because there was only his consciousness. So he had to create a consciousness that was, so to speak, outside of himself, so that he can do kindness with that. But how do you create a consciousness outside of yourself? If you're God, you have to give the created being a sense of distance, of disconnect, so that they can think of themselves as something separate, which is the nature of creation. Creation is that there's us and there's a world around us. Oh, okay, I exist. Who am I really? Because the reality is that even if you tap into this notion that at your core you're a divine being, you're still going to need to eat breakfast, right? Even Moses needed to eat. Why? Because that's the way God created us, with the self-consciousness. But now that I have a self-consciousness, now I can choose to direct that self-consciousness to the service of God. So now I'm a receiver and God's a giver. Now I got work to do. Now I can show up. Okay, so let's bring this vessel and light back to discussion of the Seder. So the matzah that sits underneath the Seder plate is the vessel. It's receiving that which is on top of it on the Seder plate. And in fact, there were those that had a custom to make the matzah in somewhat of a receptacle, like a bowl almost. It's not really the practice today, but there was such a custom, especially amongst the Kabbalists. Okay, so the matzah is a receptacle, which is a very great thing to think about when we're doing the Seder, is that we're receiving the energy of the Passover Seder, which then lends us the ability to begin to look at the items that are on the Seder plate and to try to understand what is the spiritual meaning behind them. I just want to focus on one of them. But before I do, any questions about this so far? No. Okay. By the way, if you're new here, don't be shy. We're a friendly crowd. No question is ignored. No question is shunned. So, okay. Let's look at the Seder plate. And on the right side, you have on the right side of the top, okay, so just trying to think how they have this set up over here, this picture here. Okay, so in the center, we have, I don't think this picture is accurate, but that's okay. In the center of the Seder plate, you have the maror, the bitter herbs, okay? One of the core teachings of Kabbalah is the order of the Sefirot. But very briefly, we have the 10 building blocks of creation. Is it a little warm in here? No? Okay, I can. It's cold before.
Less germs.
Less germs.
No,
Oh,
now.
see? I willed it into, look at that. Okay, so we have 10 building blocks of creation, right? The 10 Sefirot, the word Sephira comes from the word sapphire, or sapphire comes from the word Sephira, but it means to shine, to count. We're actually on the second night of Pesach, we begin to count the Sephira Sa'omer, the counting of the Omer, which it's brought down that the word Sephira means to shine, to tell, and to count. So the Sephirot are these 10 building blocks of creation, and they're found in everything. They're the DNA of existence. Classically, we talk about them as the 10 Sephirot of Atzilus, of the Bria, Yetzirah, Asiyah, of the 4 primary worlds. We also use the human being as an analogy, as a microcosm, to look at the person and understand how the spheros work. So we have the three intellectual, Chachma, Bina, and Das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And then we have 7 emotional. It's actually 6 emotional, Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, kindness, discipline, and harmony, Netzach, endurance, Hod, humility, Yesod, bonding. Those are actually 6 emotional characteristics. And then you have Malchus. Malchus means sovereignty or royalty or nobility, which is not necessarily an emotion, but it's a manifestation of the totality of the being, right? When a person shows up in the world and one shows up with a sense of self, that's Malchus. And the sense of self, as we discussed, comes from recognizing that who I truly am comes from God, right? That's why Malchus is the lowest of the 10 Sefirot. It's a receiver from all of them, but it knows who it is. And with that power, Malchus becomes the creator of the next world. Malchus becomes the crown of the next world. So if you didn't get all of that, that's also something we discuss at length throughout the year. But I want to focus on what's known as the tree of Kabbalah, the eights, the tree of life, that is the structure of the Sephiros. So you've definitely seen imagery of it, and we have to be careful that the imagery is there to convey the spiritual message. God is not a tree, and God is not right or left or center. God is. But there are different energies that God manifests that we associate with right, left, and center. And the spheros that line up on the right have a relationship with each other. The spheros that line up on the left have a relationship with each other. And the ones in the center have a relationship with each other. So intellectually, you have Chachma, Bina, Das. Chachma is on the right, Bina is on the left. Das brings them together. And the emotional characteristics, you have Chesed on the right, kindness on the right. Gevura, discipline, or Gevura also means strength or harshness, is on the left. And Tiferes, harmony or compassion or beauty, is in the center. Okay, we'll leave the rest of them for now. So first of all, there are 6 items on the Seder plate. They represent the 6 emotional characteristics that then get manifest into the matzah, into the receptacle that we spoke about before. Okay, so we're unpacking the items on the Seder plate for us to be able to use them out in their spiritual context and their spiritual meaning. But I want to focus just on the maror, on the bitter herbs. So if you were to associate maror with one of the emotional characteristics, kindness, discipline, harmony, which one would you associate it with? Gevura, which is? Good. So why is maror in the center? Gevura lives on the left, right? Gevura is on the left, which makes sense. In general, we find in Jewish teachings that the right always has precedence. God always, we give honor to the right, we give precedence to the right, because the right represents giving, loving kindness. So right always comes first. The left is what we use when we have no choice, when we have to mete out discipline, so we use the left. So why would maror not be on the left? Why is maror in the center? Why is the bitter herbs in the center? Get the question? Get the picture? Do I need to repeat it?
What's on the right and left?
You're asking on the Seder plate?
In general.
What?
It's always supposed to balance something. So what's on the right and left of more?
So on the right is the zroa, is the shank bone, right, or whatever is used to commemorate that. The left is the egg. So that's above it. So why is the maror in the middle?
Maybe because you have to have the discipline that brings everything else together,
You have to have the discipline that brings everything else together.
or gives it
Good,
meaning.
good.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. But then what is the discipline? In other words, the discipline is the tool that brings things together. The things together is where is where the discipline manifests itself. In other words, you have water, rain is blessing, is kindness. But if you don't temper the rain, it becomes a flood. So you need a tempering force, right? But if all you temper it, if you only use the tempering force, then you have a drought, right? So you have this tension. You have a give and a pull. So, but that's the job of chesed, is to give, and the job of gevurah is to hold back. Tiferes, compassion or harmony, is where that gets balanced. Let's translate it into experience. You see someone in need, your first instinct is to give, hopefully. Oh, person's in need, I'm going to give. That's kindness. Then the voice comes along and says, yeah, but maybe this person's going to use it out in the wrong way. So your voice shuts it down. I heard a great story. There was a Rebbe. The practice amongst Hasidim is when somebody comes to a Rebbe to ask for a blessing, you write your note. You always give what's called a pidyon nefesh. You give some money for the Rebbe. Some of it was for the Rebbe's household, and some of it was for the Rebbe to do charity with. So this particular Rebbe, I'm forgetting his name, had collected 300 rubles. Earlier that day, people had given, and this man came in and he says to the Rebbe, my daughter needs to get married and I don't have money to pay for the wedding. So the Rebbe says, how much do you need? So he says, I need 300 ruble. So the Rebbe takes the 300 ruble that he had collected that day and he gives it to the man. The man leaves, and the Rebbe's assistant saw this event and he says, that was very generous of you, but why did you give the guy the whole money? Like, you could have given him some of it. Why did you give him all of it? So the Rebbe said that when this man asked me, he said that he needs help for his wedding, my first instinct was, I got 300 ruble here. He needs 300 ruble. Must mean it's for him. And then as soon as I was about to give it to him, a voice came into my head that said, you can give 300 ruble to one guy, or maybe you can give 30 ruble to 10 people. And then I thought to myself, I said, that voice that's coming into my head that's saying that I should give 30 ruble to 10 people, if that was coming from a good place, why didn't that thought come first? It didn't come first. The first thought was to give this, right? The evil inclination usually is the second voice. The second voice that comes along and says, oh, don't be so holy, don't be so generous, right? That's the voice that starts talking. The evil inclination isn't usually the first one. So he says the fact that this voice didn't come first must mean it's not coming from a good place. So there's a first voice that says, give. And then there's a second voice that comes along and says, maybe you shouldn't give. And we have to start struggling with that voice, because it's not necessarily a bad voice, but we do have a responsibility, right? And some of you are thinking, you have a responsibility. Oh, that's your not generous side that's speaking. And it's true. I don't mean it's true that it's my not generous side. It's the tension that lives inside. And we have to struggle between the chesed and the gevurah to come up with tiferes. Because there are some people that deserve the chesed, and there are some people that deserve the gevurah. Some people deserve to be given, like objectively. Some people deserve to give, to be given, and some people deserve for us to hold back. When a first-time offender commits a petty crime and shows up in front of a judge, if the judge throws the book at them, you might turn this person into a monster. Conversely, when the kid who was a punk and drew a swastika on a synagogue comes before the judge, and the judge says, we're going to give you a job to go do some community service hours in an old age home where there's Holocaust survivors, that's an act of compassion, right? So you get off the highway and there's somebody standing there hungry and you smell the alcohol on their breath, you're not helping them out. But if you have a sandwich in your car and you give them the sandwich, you're helping them out. So we have to go through this thought process, right? There are some people that we need to give, and some people we need to hold back from.
Hold back sometimes is not giving. I can holding back sometimes is not giving. I mean, if you have a friend and you're out with a friend, they drink once, they drink twice, and then one third drink, you say no.
Right. So holding back then is giving is actually an expression of kindness for them. But the tool that you're using is gevura. You have to hold yourself back, or you have to hold your money back, or you have to hold back, right? It's an act of restraint. It might come easy to you, it might not come easy to you, but it's still an act of restraint. Now, here's the challenge. What happens when on paper it looks like you shouldn't give? But there's a part of you knows that this person needs that compassion.
Two together.
Beautiful. That's Tiferes. Tiferes, the compassion or the harmony or the beauty, is when the chesed and gevura and the analysis ends not to give. But the Tiferes comes and says, give anyway. Not because you're necessarily violating the chesed or the gevura, but because this instance requires the compassion. So marar, the word marar means bitter. How do we move ourselves? Right? What happens if we're in that place that we spoke about where a person is stuck in their external layers? They're stuck in their self-thinking, their self-judgment. They're stuck in their codependency. They're stuck in their mistakes. They're stuck in any of those things that hide the true identity. How do you get to the true identity, right? That's the problem. We established that that's the problem. The problem is that we're so full of self-judgment about all the things that we fall short, that we don't pay attention to the core identity, which is that we are exactly as God created us, exactly as God wanted us, so that now we can make the choice to move forward. In other words, I'll put it in simple English terms. If I live in judgment of myself, I'm a bad person. Okay, maybe you're not that hard on yourself. You just say, I lack self-control in this area. I have such terrible. I just lack self-control. I lack self-control. You tell that to yourself so many times, and then the situation presents itself. What are you going to do? You're going to lack self-control, right? It's like we now know that maybe some of you, they told us when we were kids, you're a bad boy, right? You tell a kid, you're a bad boy, you're a bad boy, you're a bad boy, you're a bad boy. Now go and clean your room. Why would I clean my room? I'm a bad boy. Like, you already established I'm a bad boy. Why, right? You're not a bad boy. You did something, you didn't even necessarily did something bad. You just did something, you didn't practice self-control, whatever. It's a whole different story, right? But we do that to ourselves. We do that to ourselves. Most people do that to ourselves, is we tell ourselves, we have voices inside of our heads that are constantly judging ourselves. And that's not who we are. Who we are is a godly being. We're a beautiful creation of Hashem. Yes, we made mistakes. Yes, we've had rough runs, and we've made bad choices, and we may have hurt people along the way. It doesn't change who we are at our core. We're this beautiful light that God put inside of us and put on this earth, and chose the circumstances within which we were born and so on. So how do we get back to that? How do we open that up? First of all, are you feeling kindness, discipline, or compassion in my talk? Compassion, right? How do we activate that compassion? Through reflection on our shortcomings. It's a crazy paradox. We have to reflect on our shortcomings to be able to realize that our soul wants more out of this world. The bitterness, the marar, the bitterness is born from self-reflection of where I've fallen short. I look at my life and I say, God put this beautiful light into this world, and it encountered this challenge and encountered that challenge, and it made some bad choices along the way, and was affected by other people's bad choices. That's a very it's a very bitter, it's a bitter dialogue. It's a bitter story. But when we finish that story, right? Think about those of you that have experienced Yom Kippur at Chabad. What's the greatest part of Yom Kippur? At the end, right? Why? You spend the whole day, you'd think at the end of the day, you'd go home and you'd cry and stuff some food in your mouth and try to ignore the world. Spent the whole day talking about all the sins and our shortcomings. But what that does is it births this beautiful light. It exposes the beautiful light inside of us. And it says, yeah, you got this amazing soul. Okay, so along the way, there's been challenges. But now that you're in touch with that beautiful light, let it shine. Right? So that's why the Maror lives in the center of the Seder plate, in the place of compassion. Yes, it's bitter, but bitter is not bad. Bitter is not harsh. It's a means to bring us to a much greater place. Does this make sense? Okay, let's do a few, well, what time is it? 10:40. Okay, a few more things. Matzah. Matzah in Kabbalah is called Michla de Mehemnusa, the bread of faith. And it's also called Michla de Asvasa, which means the bread of healing.
What happened to affliction? I always heard of something.
We don't believe in that one. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm a false spot.
So yeah, we actually say that at the beginning of the Haggadah, we say, hey lach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction. So lach ma'anya also means poor man's bread. So again, maybe with what we just shared about the Maror, it is not, its objective is not to be afflicting. Its objective is to bring out something deeper. So, which by the way, which was the entire purpose of Egypt, was to prepare us for the revelation at Sinai that came afterwards. And it's a metaphor for life. God is not out to make our lives miserable. God is out to bring out our own life, our own light, to expose the light within us. So, so the matzah, it injects into us faith and healing. Now, faith is understood. It's a bread, it's a food substance that we eat in an act of faith. And we ingest it into us. We bring it into our body, right? So what's beautiful about this, again, is that the vessel, which is the physicality, is just a manifestation of the divine light. We bring that into harmony when we use the physical world in the service of God. What we're basically saying is that the physicality of the world is really divinity. And it's been given to us in order to serve God through it. In other words, what differentiates the vessel from the light? It's only our consciousness, right? If it's all coming from God, what makes one vessel one light? It's just how we relate to it. But if we can change the frequency, suddenly we could see in the physicality the divine energy that sustains it, which is what Adam and Eve experienced in the Garden of Eden. They saw the word of God in the tree. They saw the word of God in the garden. So the result of the sin is that our frequency, we can't really get past that one particular dial. When Mashiach comes, we'll get there. But until then, through intellect, through contemplation, through study, through meditation, through prayer, we can heighten our consciousness. We can change the frequency a little bit, right? So the vessel is really divine energy. When we use it out in the service of God with intention, we actually access the divine energy that's in it. So when we take this flour and water that we call matzah, and we say a blessing on it, and we eat it in the service of God, it injects into us, it becomes part of our being, and it injects into us faith. So according to the Zohar, the second night, matzah is the bread of healing. And traditionally, there are many stories of holy people who were able to use the matzah to bring healing to people. But here's a beautiful teaching, okay? So let's remember, the first night is the bread of faith. Second night is the bread of healing. So there's a passage that says the following. that when faith brings healing, there was no illness in the first place. But when healing brings faith, there was illness that we were cured from, but the residue remains. Something to that effect. Let's explain what that means. So when a person, and then by the way, when we talk about healing here, we mean both physical healing, but we also mean spiritual healing. When we say to God, heal me, and then when I'm healed, I'll know you're real, right? That means I've established that there's an illness, and that because God healed me, so therefore I know that God's real. Right? It's conditional in a sense. So the result of that is that there was an illness that I've been healed from, but the illness it was there. However, when faith brings healing, someone's not well, and they say, God, I know you have the ability to bring healing. So I already know that God is real. And then I can explore, why is there illness in the first place? God has a purpose in it. And that faith alone is what brings the healing. But the result of that is that the illness was never really an illness. It was just a means for me to strengthen my faith. Which is why the sequence is that the first night is faith and the second night is healing. Did that make sense? I'm getting too many blank
You
stares.
have to have faith before there can be healing.
No, you could have healing that brings to faith, but that's like a conditional relationship. And some people begin a relationship with God on a conditional level. There's a it's not so popular today, but probably in the 80s and the 90s, the Jewish outreach movement in our modern times was really initiated by the Rebbe. Right? Back in the day, the Rebbe sent out emissaries to cities and so on, which now is all over the world. And when the Rebbe first started the outreach campaign, you had leaders of other Jewish movements that said, "Oh, Jews need to, keep a low profile, that's not our thing. What are you proselytizing on the streets?" and so on. And even many Orthodox movements were antagonistic to it. But then in the 80s, they realized, okay, maybe we do have a responsibility to the rest of the Jewish world. But their approach was very different than the Rebbe's approach. The Rebbe's approach was, you see a Jew, wrap tefillin with them. You see a Jew, encourage them to light Shabbat candles. You see a Jew, invite them to come for services, right? Just do Jewish. This other approach was, let's get people into a room and we're going to explain to them the truth of the Torah. You may have heard of the Bible codes. Bible codes was a computerized analysis of the Torah that showed sequences and patterns, and the objective was to prove intellectually that the Torah has its origin, and so on and so forth, which was a total departure from the Rebbe's approach. Why? Because if my relationship with God is based on intellect, then it's a very finite, limited relationship. What we're talking about here is the next level. If my relationship with God is what God does for me, then there's a me that has a problem that God is helping me fix. But if my relationship with God starts with an act of faith, then even when I have illness, the illness is there for a purpose. God is there to help me navigate that. In other words, how do you look at challenge? If you're approaching a relationship with God from this God consciousness place, how do you look at challenge that's in front of you? Do you see it as a as something that's trying to crush you? Or do you see it as something trying to help you grow? Was there's a saying, darkness is not in the way, it is the way, right? Like, how do you see it? Is this something that's interfering? Or is this something that's bringing me, it's a stepping stone to bringing me closer to God? By the way, think about it in human relationships. When you encounter tension with your spouse or with a good friend, if your whole relationship is a conditional one, you've heard the expression, you see it on TV, you see it in the movies, and maybe you even hear a friend or two say it, says, I don't need this. I don't need this. You ever hear people say that? My wife's driving me crazy. I don't need this. You don't need this. What does that mean? You don't need this. Like this is about a need. Like you're here because you have a need. If you have a need, then you're right. Then you don't need this. But who needs the tension? But it's not about a need, right? A relationship's not about a need. I mean, this relationship, a love relationship, an intimate relationship, it's about a connection. You can't absolve yourself by saying, I don't need this. You do need it. So if illness is if God's healing of the illness is the terms of my relationship, then that means that, yes, I will come to a place of faith as a result. Yeah, I believe, I see God did what I asked him to. But then the illness was real and the healing brought, the healing strengthened my faith in God. But if the faith is what comes first, then the illness is just a stepping stone to deepening the relationship. So once the relationship is, once that stepping stone is recognized, the illness is gone. It's not there in the first place.
Question is like during like a time where like things are hard and like you have like I guess a conflict or something that you want like God faith or something like to help you. Like how do you make sure that's not a conditional relationship? Like how do you go into the faith first and stuff?
Yeah, great question. I think what we need to do is first of all accept our own fallibility, that there is a tension there, right? I think what happens is you just heard me share an ideal, but we're still a human being, even with that ideal. And when we bump up against that question and the self-analysis, as we say in the Haggadah, Dayenu, right? You've already accomplished what you need to because you're reflecting on the nature of your relationship. And just by reflecting on the nature of your relationship, you've already elevated the relationship, right? I'm not saying that the guy who says, I don't need this, right, never gets frustrated in his relationship, as his wife probably does as well. It's not a question that we don't get frustrated. The question is, what do we do when we get frustrated? Do we then relegate our relationship to the external? Or do we remind ourselves that, yes, life is challenging. There is darkness in front of me. There's a challenge in front of me. But my connection is inherently deeper than that. And therefore, that's this place I want to move to. And that's what a relationship is. That's real. That's very real. Did I answer your question? Yes.
When I think of that, and this is something, a lot of people struggle with, God forbid, the Holocaust. You see people who survive and it's bifurcated. Some they've thrown God this way and others they see it this way.
Yeah. So that's that's also that's also the human condition, which is to become extreme, but it's not sustainable because the one who goes that way lives in darkness and the one who goes that way ignores their darkness. Let's do a few rapid fire question ideas. Okay, the middle matzah, we break the middle matzah. The beginning of the Seder, we break the middle matzah. It's called yachatz on page 11. So the custom is to take the middle matzah and the half of the matzah is set aside for the afikomen. That's the part that the kids try to find or steal. Chabad custom is we don't steal. It's actually a biblical commandment, but the Chabad custom is we don't steal. We don't do that at the Seder, so as not to encourage unhealthy behavior. So sometimes we'll hide it and let the kids try to find it, but they don't steal. But the idea is the half that we put aside, we put away for the afikomen, which we will eat at the end of the meal, the end of the Seder, before we say the after blessing and the third cup of wine, drink the third cup of wine. It commemorates the Passover sacrifice. Now, the custom is to take that piece that we set aside and to break it into 5 pieces. So who remembers the middle matzah represents which of our forefathers? Isaac, very good. So remember, we have chesed, gevura, tiferes, kindness, discipline, compassion. We have Avraham is kindness, Yitzchak is discipline, Yaakov is compassion or harmony, which in their stories of their lives, they parallel this. Yitzchak represents gevura. The middle matzah is the one we're breaking because gevura has that power to break. We break it into 5 pieces because gevura has 5 manifestations. So the strength is in the arm, right? The energy comes from here and it manifests itself in 5 fingers. You may recall later in the Haggadah, we talk about there's an interesting discussion. How many plagues were there? So there says there were 10 in Egypt and 50 at the sea. Then there says there were 50 in Egypt and 250 at the sea and so on and so forth. There's this whole discussion, which is basically an analysis of yad, the hand. It says God's mighty hand. How many times does it say hand? How many fingers are on the hand and so on and so forth? You'll pay attention to when you read the Haggadah. But the main point is that there are 5 fingers, which is a physical manifestation of a divine energy that gevura, discipline, is meted out in 5 measures. How do you, when you encounter the harshness of discipline, how do you resolve it? Or to use Kabbalistic terms, how do you sweeten the discipline? You sweeten discipline by bringing the discipline back to its source. What does that mean? Discipline that comes from above is always rooted in love. Because God is loving kindness. So God doesn't, it's a very important principle. There's no such thing as punishment in the Torah. It's consequence. You stick your finger in fire, you're going to get burned. The fire doesn't hate you. Fire doesn't have anything out with you. It's the way God created the world. When you stick your finger in fire, you're going to get burned. And by the way, it's the way it works with Hashem's commandments. You do a mitzvah, you'll keep the channel open. God forbid one does the opposite, you clog up channels. It's just a spiritually natural flow that God built into creation. God is kindness. So when we experience discipline from above, it's really God's kindness manifest in this disciplined form. How do we move away from the harshness of the discipline? How do we sweeten it? You got to bring it back to its source. When we recognize that in the harshness, in the discipline, like we mentioned before, the idea of challenge, right? The challenge could either crush me if I see the challenge as having an agenda with me. But if I see the challenge as God's way of helping me grow, then it becomes a springboard. But I have to go to the source of the challenge. I have to understand why the challenge is there in the first place in order for me to climb my way back to the source. That's called sweetening gevuras, hamtakas hagvuras, to sweeten the discipline. The middle matzah is Yitzchak. We sweeten the middle matzah with the influence of Avraham, of Abraham, who's loving kindness, which is why we eat this part of the middle matzah at the end of the Seder, which is afiko man, the afikomen, which means that we bring down the energy of the Passover sacrifice into the afikomen. We digest that at the end of the meal. At the end is the true experience of liberation that we do at the end of the Seder. Okay, one last thing that we'll leave you with. Maybe next year we'll do this, start a class or two earlier because there's a lot to go. So one quick teaching in the Haggadah, page 15, 16, right? So we have the story. It's told of Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Zariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon, that they were once reclining at Bnei Brak and were recounting the story of the coming forth from Egypt all that night until their pupils came and said to them, "Our masters, the time has come for reciting the Shema prayer of the morning." So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah comments on this exchange, and he says, "I am as one of 70 years of age, yet I was not able to convince my colleagues to have the exodus from Egypt told at night until Ben Zoma explained it. And he said that the verse says that you may remember the day when you came forth from the land of Egypt all the days of your life. The days of your life implies only the days. All the days of your life, the all includes the nights. The sages, however, say the days of your life refer to this world. All the days of your life includes the Messianic era." Okay, there's a lot to unpack in here, but I'm going to focus on the part that you're not thinking about. What's the part you're not thinking about? What does it mean? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, "I am as one of 70 years of age." So he's saying this statement. I am 70 years of age, and I didn't merit to say the Shema to mention the Exodus at night until I heard this analysis of this verse. Okay. What he's basically saying is that I'm already 70, right? I'm already an old man. And it took me a long time to come to this place where I got this insight. So why doesn't he say I am 70? Why does he say I am as 70?
Why, sir?
So there's a story. It's a story that's told that it's a long story. There was a conflict that took place in the high court, and they fired the rabbis. Fired the head of the Sanhedrin, the head of the court, and because he was being obstinate with the other rabbis, so they fired him. But they needed a new head, so they looked around and they saw this 18-year-old kid there, and they said, "This guy's amazing. He's the most amazing guy here." His name was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. They said, "We're going to appoint you tomorrow as the head of the court." This 18-year-old, I saw in the commentary, some say he was 15, some say he was 13. He comes home to his wife, and he says to his wife, he says, "They want to appoint me the head of the court, but look at me, I got a black beard. Nobody's gonna give me the time of day." So that night, when he slept, a miracle occurred and he aged. So when he woke up in the morning, he looked like he was a 70-year-old man. Story's not over. The Arizal, his wife's fault. The Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, says that he was actually a Gilgul. He was a reincarnation of, I'm forgetting who it was, who lived 52 years. So he actually adopted the 52 years of that prior incarnation, combined with his 18 years, he was 70. Now, here's the question. He makes a statement. I am as if I am 70 years. In other words, he's trying to make a point that I'm an old man, right? I'm an old man, and this is the first opportunity that I have to be able to mention the Exodus at night. But you're not an old man. You're only 18 years old. You just look like an old man. How does his statement carry weight if that's what's going on here? Understand the question? He's making this announcement. I'm like an old man, and I haven't had a chance. Sometimes like kids act like they're old men. Oh, you lived such a long life. You didn't live a long life. You're 18 years old, you pisher. You haven't lived. You barely lived, and you're talking about as if you lived this long life and you didn't have the opportunity. You haven't lived long enough. Live at 70 years, and you'll have the opportunity. So the Rebbe teaches something very powerful from here, which I think is a great message to end on, which is that we are empowered by the positive qualities of those that come before us, but we don't carry any of their baggage. We don't carry any of the negativity. The concept of reincarnation is very real. oftentimes people get stuck on this sense of self that they lived in another lifetime, this dark life. Doesn't work. You don't carry that. You don't carry any negative with you. By definition, negativity is the absence of light. Darkness is the absence of light. So when a person's life ends, the darkness ends with them. But the positive light is real and it's eternal. So whatever positive things are carried over in our soul, they come with us, to the point that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah could say, I am like 70 because I have all of the prior experience plus this life experience. That's a powerful message for us. So let's maybe the takeaway we could from today's discussion is that each of us have inside of ourselves a beautiful, beautiful light. It's the light of the infinite one, and we just need to let it shine. And all of the negativity that perhaps we adopted along the way is our own narrative, and it's not. It's there for us to realize it's a springboard to help us get closer to God. And may this holiday be a true holiday of liberation for all of us in our personal lives, in our familiar lives, and should have only goodness. If anybody needs a place for a Seder, we have a community Seder here Saturday night. You're welcome to join us. Please sign up. Please take the Haggadah home. And that's all she wrote.